Welcome to another Northern Monkeys video. This time we're going to do a breakdown of how to build a Space Marine army list. So despite being pushed as the beginner faction by Games Workshop, Space Marines are actually quite complicated. A massive amount of data sheets and lots of traps to fall into. It's really good to just have a good breakdown of what makes a solid Space Marine army. And one of the first things is your detachment choice. You've got 17 to choose from after the new 500 Worlds came out. Some of these are duplicates, some of these aren't very good, but either way it can be quite overwhelming. And on top of all that, you then have to pick your Space Marine chapter, which is a thing unique to the Space Marine army. So the way this works, on top of being Adeptus Astartes, lots of Space Marine units also have a chapter keyword, and basically this just locks you into the one specific thing. So if you take Jagatai Khan, Sabodan Khan here, those data sheets, that means you're then locked out of other chapters' data sheets. So this just adds another layer to Space Marines. If you want to take a certain detachments as well, they're locked to certain chapters. So you can play Shadowmark Talon without being Raven Guard. Sometimes though, this gives you a nice little buff, like Ethan Shan here, giving you a bit more CP economy. And other times it's a massively defining feature for this detachment. The Hammer of Averni, it's a fun detachment, but I'd say without the bonus you get for having Cannock Var in it, it's not a very good detachment at all. At least not on a highly competitive level. And all of this, it can have newer players feeling a bit like this guy as they're trying to put together their first army, sort of cobbled together with suboptimal units that they picked up from box sets or just enthusiastically because they thought they looked nice. So I just want to say before we get into this guide as well, I'm going to talk more about how to build a generally good army. I'm not going to talk about the sort of meta hotness at the moment. You know, if you want that, go and look at things like Goonhammer, go and look at things like the Warhammer competitive subreddit. You'll be able to find roughly the same kind of Ultramarines list with the new Vitrix Guard, the good characters, and then a ton of vehicles. That's a fine thing to play if you want to play that way, but ultimately it's not going to teach you great 40k fundamentals by just sort of spamming these broken data sheets. So the way I like to play Space Marines is a bit of a combined arms approach. That means you're going to have some shooting, some fighting, some skirmishing, all stuff like that. I'm going to do this from a sort of chapter agnostic point of view, so there's not going to be any epic heroes in this, and I'm going to use a generalist detachment as well. Gladius Task Force just sort of fits everything quite well, but we're going to talk about some of the more specific synergies with that. I do think it is the best sort of detachment, even though it's very, very complicated. It's still a good one for beginners because it gives you a lot of options and a lot of ways to express your skill and learn the game. We're going to look at some early game skirmishers, some late game secondary scoring, some damage threats, melee and shooting like we talked about earlier, and then some good ways to sort of hold primary objectives as Space Marines. And just for those of you who kind of joined in 10th edition, we're going to keep the Leviathan box set in mind, try and pick up a few of the units out of this. It's a thing a lot of people have, and I think it's worth considering with these guides. So early game scoring, these are the models that are going to try and start up the board. They're the ones who are going to sort of step out into the open, score your secondary objectives, threaten some primary objectives, and kind of force your opponent to trade with them and do so efficiently. Space Marines just happen to have three of perhaps the most broken data sheets out there for this. The Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, just absolutely amazing. This guy infiltrates, he's tough, he fights okay, and he has a free reactive move built into him. An incredible game piece, especially with that lone operative, combined with the reactive move, just makes him so tough. The Scout Squad, these guys again, not only do they start up the board with their infiltrate ability, they also then have a scout move, which lets them get back into safety, move forward more aggressively. You can move block with these guys. And then on top of that, they can go back into reserves if they're still alive at the end of your opponent's turn. So absolutely fantastic unit there. Most of my lists, if I'm trying to really play the game, is going to have these two units in. And I also like one or two squads of Incursors. I'm just going with wood in this list because we already have the Scouts and the Combi Lieutenant. But Incursors are a great piece. They have mortal wound potential, they have that scout ability again, and they're only 80 points. So they're not a unit that you feel too sad about throwing away. But these guys brawl well with enemy units. You know, they have those sustained hits, they have ignores cover on their guns. Just a really, really good, strong unit. And with that Melter Mine, they can crack out a lot of mortal wounds. It's a good data sheet to think about. Now late game scoring, I think just one unit is necessary here. Space Marines have loads of different choices in this area, so there's a lot of competition going on. And this is a good place as well, is as you get to your 2000 points, if you're kind of running out, you can upgrade and downgrade these different units here. So you've got options like the more expensive Vanguard vets, who are kind of tricky to kill with that 4-up invulnerable save. But these units, they're really more looking just to come down out of deep strike and score some secondaries. So that's kind of what you want out of these guys. So maybe you don't need to spend all those points for the Vanguard vets. You can do it cheaper with Reavers, who can mess with your opponent's primary, or you can do it with Suppressors. They're even cheaper. You know, if you just need to get those last few points so you can fit a better unit in, Suppressors are a great place that I like to go. But none of these are really going to make the cut. For this list, I just happen to have enough points to go for the Assault Intercessors with jump packs. These guys are absolutely great. A nice middle ground at 90 points, it's where Marines like to be. They have a good volume of melee that's a little bit dangerous with that power fist in there. They do mortal wounds on the charge, which is a really good thing to look for. You know, a lot of targets are very tough to take down with invuns and the like, high armor saves. Just being able to use units like Incursors and these Assault Intercessors with jump packs to come down, do mortal wounds in a variety of different ways, not just the grenade stratagem. Really, really good. And on top of that, because of their threat, you can use these guys to kind of rapid ingress and attack your opponent's skirmishes if you need to. So it's nice to have them just for that kind of high movement, that deep strike. They do everything you want. Moving on to damage threats in melee, we've got the Blade Guard veterans. There's not that many great options for this in Space Marines, but the reason we picked a big 6-man unit of Blade Guard veterans is because they've got a certain leader that can go in them that is really, really special. And they're really good in Gladius, which makes them a little bit faster with access to advance and charge, but also gives them a stratagem for lance, so +1 to wound on the charge. Really, really good. Just makes these guys a lot more of a competent melee threat. So we're going to boost these guys up with a Judiciar. He's only 70 points, and he basically gives you fights first on your unit. That's why you're having him in this squad of Blade Guard. This makes an incredible tool, really powerful against enemy melee armies, really powerful at protecting your primary points. You can set them up kind of in a ruin near your opponent, and then with your opponent, you put one of your units on a primary objective. If your opponent wants to charge into your unit to take it off that objective, you've got these Blade Guard with a Judiciar and fights first, just waiting around the corner. Use the heroic intervention stratagem, you go in, and your Blade Guard can fight the enemy unit with the Judiciar's attacks in there as well. It's a really, really good unit. It's a big investment, but if you use it right, it can totally win you the game. And just to add to this, I think with this really important key unit, you want to keep it safe. So an Impulsor, it's a nice little transport. It can now take 7 Space Marines inside of it. So it's really, really good. It gives you some funny movement shenanigans. We've got Incursors in this squad, so what you can do is start your Incursors in the Impulsor with your Blade Guard nearby. When the game starts, because everything inside the Impulsor has the Scout's ability, that means the Impulsor gets a 6-inch Scout move, it can make itself safe, it can move forward, whatever you want to do with it. And then on its turn, the Incursors get out, go do their thing, maybe on an objective, you know, make use of that disembark to get a bit more movement. And then the Blade Guard, they run up and get in the Impulsor, which then moves. It gives you a great amount of movement shenanigans and lets you get into position with those Blade Guard, who might traditionally be a little bit slow. Now, really, really good here. It's 80 points with that shield dome on it. You might be tempted, like me, to put a missile launcher on it, just try and get a bit more value out of the shooting. But the shield dome is the best choice. It's just the chance that your opponent puts like a bunch of bright lances into this thing, and you just happen to make a couple of those 5-up invuns and survive. It can just really throw a cog in the works for your opponent, especially when it's protecting an important unit like those Blade Guard. Now, also, if you don't want this Impulsor for the Blade Guard, it's not essential. So this could easily be swapped out for anything like Intercessors or some other kind of scoring piece like those Reavers and the like. But I like the Impulsor with those Blade Guard. But thinking to that combined arms approach, let's think about these damage threats in melee. You often kind of want a cheap but very, very dangerous unit that's going to go out and brawl with your opponent's big stuff once it's on the points. You know, you've drawn them out with those Scouts and Incursors. Now you need to actually get in there, punch your opponent off objectives. a captain with assault intercessors. I've done a couple of videos about why these guys are so good in both these datasheet breakdowns that we've done. But yeah, one of the best combos in the Codex, really strong for this kind of melee unit, especially in Gladius. The captain can make a stratagem free once per turn, which means you can use things like your advance and charge stratagem for free. You can use your lance on the charge stratagem. Amazing. You can even reduce the cost of your fight on death if you're kind of fighting over an objective with your opponent. And yeah, not as expensive as the Judiciar and the Blade Guard, but a very potent threat. However, it does kind of rely on your opponent being an objective. Now this is a combo I noticed while I was playtesting the Hammer of Verni detachment. Essentially, a squad of Stern Guard with a captain. Now, a little bit more expensive than those assault intercessors, so if you need to cut some points, you could easily sort of replace these guys with more assault intercessors. But the nice thing about this tool is, on top of the Stern Guard just being great, I think having the chance to be able to splash a few mortal wounds onto the Oath target, if maybe it survived your like anti-tank shooting and you just need to chip those last few wounds off, the Stern Guard are actually very reliable to do that with their dev wounds into the Oath target specifically. But also, they give the full wound rerolls into the Oath target, which means your captain's like power, with that power fist that he's going to get out of them, and all their melee attacks, they have a lot, and the fact that you can give them AP in this detachment is very quite strong. But the nice thing about these guys is your opponent doesn't have to go on the objective. They don't get to control when you can use this kind of captain missile. So by having the assault intercessors maybe protecting one objective, having these guys maybe onto the middle or somewhere where your opponent's not going to be an objective, I really like that kind of toolbox approach, and this is kind of an example of that, kind of having the different tools for the different matchups. So we hit 965 points. Let's have a bit of a recap. We've got a scout squad, a lieutenant with combi weapon, and the incurser squad. These guys are going to play the early game, generally kind of make your opponent have a few headaches and kind of give them some choices that might bait them out into your other units. We've got a unit of assault intercessors with jump packs. 99% of the time these guys are going to start in Deep Strike Reserve and they're just going to wait on their chance turn 2 and 3 to just score some secondaries, or they can rapid ingress in and threaten some of your opponent's units if they've gotten the best of you in the trade war. Got a Judiciar with a 6-man unit of Blade Guard veterans. They're all in their Impulsor. Really good here, just a good solid threat that's kind of going to make your opponent think twice about attacking your objectives. And then we've got a couple of variable melee missiles in the captains with Stern Guard and assault intercessors. So now let's get to the really juicy stuff, your shooting damage. Now, you need to be able to sort of counter and punch big enemy units at range, just kind of a fact of the game. If you have too much melee, I often find your opponent gets to dictate the pace and the engagements, so unless you kind of go all in and overwhelm them, you can end up on the back foot. The Vindicator, Space Marines have a lot of nice pieces, but I like this one for them. With the Oath of Moment, it's a lot less unreliable than it used to be. In Gladius, it's got that advance and shoot, you can give it access to AP4 with the Storm of Fire stratagem. Just really good stuff. Like, the difference between AP3 and AP4 ignores cover is just night and day, especially if your opponent has Armour of Contempt and the like. I do quite like putting this guy in reserves. I find it's a good way to kind of keep him safe if you've not got enough terrain to hide everyone behind, and then it sort of makes up for his range as well. Be careful that you don't do this on the wrong map where there's kind of ruins blocking the line of sights from strategic reserves, but yeah, it's a strong unit, the Vindicator. So we've talked about these Stern Guard, we've talked about this Vindicator, but a lot of these units, they're like quite reliant on the Oath of Moment. Now, say you need that somewhere else, but you still want to sort of put pressure on your opponent's backfield, well, that's where 2 Ballistas Dreadnoughts come in. They don't need Oath so much, because if your opponent's above half strength, which they will be the majority of the time, you get full hit rerolls, which is really nice. And again, these guys are only 300 points. They're very tough for that, they're relatively fast with the move 8, and they have a great long range, so you can very reliably kind of point them down the field, play some angles, kind of blast your opponent. And on top of having all their las cannons and their crack missiles, you can also just use their frag missile profile. So if your opponent's like a big horde army, like Guard or GSC, these guys are actually helpful in those matchups as well. And there's no restriction on that ability, so feel free to split fire and put your frag missiles into a big horde and then blast a vehicle with the las cannons. Totally fine. Now, one cool thing here as well is and this is the kind of the thing that's spammed in the meta lists. At a certain point with the Space Marine army, you can hit a sort of critical mass of tough vehicles with a 2-up save, and it can kind of be a case of like turns 2 or 3, you put all of these out there and blast your opponent and go, you're just not going to be able to deal with all of these. And maybe they kill 1 or 2 of them, but then you get to counterattack and kill whatever killed those. It's quite a good strategy, really. And to help with that, when we're talking about primary objective holders, the Redemptor Dreadnought. He just came down below 200 points with that Macroplasma Incinerator. He's absolutely fantastic. The -1 damage ability that he has can really counter certain armies. Orcs hate to see this guy across from them. Things like Deathwing Knights, he can actually bog them down. Ironically, they've got -1 damage, but are hurt by -1 damage. So yeah, really strong there from the Dreadnought. And this guy's really good, sort of coming out in the later game and standing on an objective while you've got all your Ballistas and your Vindicators there, and your opponent's just like, not going to have enough gun to deal with all of this, just going to be overwhelmed by all these 2-up saves and these hulls. This list doesn't have the biggest extension of that, but it certainly is a thing you can do. And on top of all that, the Redemptor also has a big damage 3 plasma cannon, which can be really dangerous into certain units and kind of keep your opponent very wary. And also, this comes in every list, but I think it should do, a unit of Intercessors. Essentially, what these guys do is, for 80 points, if they stand on an objective and hold it in the command phase, you then hold that until your opponent takes it off you. Really strong. They have a fairly other crazy ability where they have 4 shots apiece if they fire all their guns into the same target. They're actually a pretty heinously strong unit for 80 points. Like, it's an absolutely stacked thing. And every competitive list has at least 1 unit in of these guys. And there's no reason not to do that, They're a base battle line troop for the Space Marines. Very good. You could, at this point, pick up some Infiltrators. These guys basically are a bit more of an expensive infantry unit, but their gimmick is that enemy can't deep strike within 12. That can be really good for locking down your backfield. But I've found with Space Marines, those Ballistas Dreadnoughts, the Intercessors all hanging around in the backfield, it's just really good at blocking that out anyway. So that's why I didn't go for the extra points for those Infiltrators. So to have a bit of another recap, we've got those early game skirmishing pieces, the Scouts, the Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, the Incursors. We've got some Brawler units. We've got the Assault Intercessors with Jump Packs, the Judiciar, the 2 Captains and their various units. All a bit of technical play around those Impulsors and the like. And then we've got a good core of shooting. The Vindicator, the Ballistas, the Redemptor, and the Intercessors to hold those primary points and screen your backfield. It's looking good. At this point, if you're playing a certain Divergent chapter, you could definitely sort of sprinkle in, say, Suboden Khan and some Outriders, get a bit of value there. You could throw in perhaps one of the other, like Lysander and some Terminators. It's really down to you. However, looking at this list right now, I still think it has a bit of a weakness in terms of like being susceptible to things like Guard, Rogel Dawn, Hull Spam, Knights and the like. Even with the double Ballistas and the Vindicator, it just might not be enough. So with the points we have left, you could plump for something like a Lancer or the like, but I've gone for an Eradicator squad. These guys are kind of nice to be able to sort of threaten to use those Devastator Doctrine again to advance and shoot in Melter range. They're not very susceptible to Overwatch, so they can always just kind of run up the middle and kind of catch your opponent off guard that way. And they're not the most consistent thing, but I do like them, and I think they are a good way to just like get a little splash of anti-tank in your list. They can even go in strategic reserves if range is going to be a problem, a bit like that Vindicator. Finally, the other weakness I think this army have, they just don't quite have those melee kind of like forward pressure threats. Now you've got things like the Captains and their squads, you've got the Blade Guards, but they're all a little predictable for your opponent, right? Even with access to advance and charge, they can kind of measure out where they're going to go. I've gone for a unit Terminators here. Really good. They don't get as much rating as I think they should, but they're only 170 points. They're not like a mega investment unit, and they're actually really decent. You give them more power fists, they have a lot of attacks, especially with access to things like Lance and the extra AP. It can really take their damage kind of over the edge into the point where they will actually overwhelm any kind of like medium enemy unit. And the really good thing about these guys is, because they have that deep strike, they have those beacons to be able to rapid ingress for free, it gives your opponent that thing to think about. When they're doing their turn, not only do they have to think about your whole army being able to advance and shoot, advance and charge, but also they've got to think about these Terminators, who are just going to sort of come down, rapid ingress somewhere, fire a load of Stormbolter shots off, fire some missile launcher shots off, which into the Oath of Moment target aren't nothing, and then charge in and fight. And they can steal your opponent's home objective from pretty much any unit that's going to be left back there. And if your opponent puts something massive back there to defend it because of your Terminators, that's a win too. They can come in and out of deep strike somewhere else. So yeah, I think with the amount of points I had left here, I really like the Terminator squad. I think they're very underrated, and they always do work for me, especially at that 170 point price point. And now, with the last 15 points, well, there's one option here really, it's the Honor of Airmen. You could maybe give Artificer Armour to one of your captains to make them a bit tougher, maybe even on the Judiciar to stop him from being sniped out of the unit, but generally that's not such an issue with the Judiciar since you have fights first. But what's really good, the Honor of Airmen. This thing gives you extra attacks, extra strength. This is great on the captains. If they're in the Assault Doctrine, it can take them up to strength 10, which is a really big break point. Essentially can act as like +1 to wound against a lot of vehicles and tougher infantry, which is great on those guys. However, they're often going to have access to full wound rerolls, and the Judiciar isn't. Now, he adds a significant amount of punch to the Blade Guard, and with this enhancement, he goes all the way up to 6 attacks and strength 8. That strength 8 is a really big break point, probably even bigger than strength 10. So, yeah. Wounding stuff on 2s, it's going to mean he has built-in precision. He is actually going to be a lot better with 6 attacks hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s because of the Blade Guard, wounding on 2s. You know, he's just going to have a lot more of a chance to kind of wipe out an opposing character out of your enemy unit. So that's really good. And I just think it's a good break point for him. So as a bit of a final recap, let's just look at the list as a whole. And I think it's shaping up quite well. Those scouts, the lieutenant, and the incursors, they give you a really good way to play the early game, give you plenty of utility, access to mortal wounds, and just generally can kind of force out your opponent's pieces by kind of trading up and being more efficient than they are. In the later game, you've got the Assault Intercessors with jump packs. They can come down and score points. Just a really decent, efficient unit. And again, they can threaten that kind of, well, we're going to do mortal wounds on the charge, we're going to throw a grenade. They can definitely pack a bit more punch than your opponent might think, especially going into the Oath target. And then we've got a big kind of threat, that Repulsor, which can do scout shenanigans with those incursors, bit of a synergy there. And it can also carry the Judiciar with his strength 8, 6 attacks, and the Blade Guard veterans. They can protect your objectives with their heroic intervention, sort of bail those scouts, or the lieutenant with combi weapon. And it can kind of give your opponent these puzzles that are kind of hard to solve. Or they can just disembark out of that, advance and charge, and go smash something in melee. It's always an option, right? You are a Space Marine at the end of the day. And especially with that lieutenant with the combi weapon and his lone op, these guys are an absolutely great way to help you hold primary. However, you want to deny your opponent's primary a little bit, so you've got this captain, he's got Assault Intercessors with him, it's a nice cheap little unit, and generally we'll just be able to punch opponents' kind of medium strength units off objectives, where you're like incursors might not be up to the job. You then also got a captain with Stern Guard veterans. These guys are a great source of dev wounds that can kind of help finish off your target if it's a really tough vehicle, or you've just got unlucky and your opponent maybe spiked a couple of 5s and 6s on their saves. So they're a great little unit for that. And also can just trade, you know, still only 180 points, and with the sheer volume of attacks from the captain's power fist, the sergeant's power fist, and then all their little melee slices, can just be really good. And you're kind of keeping a good command point efficiency here, thanks to these captains. And you can spend those command points on your big fancy vehicles. You've got your Vindicator, your Ballistus Dreadnoughts, your Redemptor Dreadnought. These are all great shooting pieces, they're going to give your opponent a bit of a headache. And then combined with that Redemptor standing on a primary point, it might really give your opponent like a headache just trying to clear off all these 2+ saves. Really good stuff. And then never forget the Intercessors holding down the backfield. They might not seem like the most glamorous thing to have, but genuinely, these guys can like win the game for you. And then, just a little thing to pick up some more anti-tank. Got the Eradicator squad. They are swingy, but they're still quite good. And 90 points, it's not so bad to pay for them. And then finally, for a bit more forward pressure, a bit of a rapid ingress threat, the Terminator Squad. Definitely one of the more cerebral kind of play pieces in this army, but really good. And there's plenty of places to swap things out. If you want a bit more skirmishing power, a bit more trading, you could take away that repulsor, add in another squad of incursors, that's really good. You could swap out, the captain and the stern guard for a bit more shooting if you wanted. Just whatever you want to do. And of course the big sort of, almost 500 points in the Vindicator and the Ballistus Dreadnought, that could be any number of kind of gladiator tanks or the like. It's just down to personal preference, really. So yeah, ultimately, this was a bit of a toolbox approach to Marine list building. Just a really, really nice way to go. This army can kind of do everything. Like Space Marines, they have such a massive array of data sheets. You can play however you want. You can play a big melee bull rush, you can play a gun line, you can play a kind of weird skirmishy piece. But ultimately, with how cheap Marines have become, in terms of their units, I really, really like this. Now, it's not an optimised list that I've just come up with by any means. There's more playtesting that could be done with it. You can definitely optimise it just by putting certain chapter characters in here. But those all require I kind of think certain detachments and certain chapters. While Gladius is really, really good, I think there are some very niche specific things you can do that are very, very strong. But what I really, really like about this list is it has loads of active threats. I don't think this is going to be storming worlds by any chance, but it's a really good way to kind of learn the game, right? Learn about these fundamentals of play, learn about how to use your stratagems right, how to plan out your turn. Gladius is, for how strong it is still an incredibly complicated detachment, and all those different moving pieces that you have. And you learn about things like screening with your ballistas and your intercessors. You've got a late game scoring potential. I mean, heck, I've even had the Terminators come in and do established locus and score behind enemy lines, That's just come up sometimes and not had the jump pack intercessors available. So there's just so many options you can do with this and so many weird little combos. But it still does an absolute ton of damage. You've got the Vindicator, you've got all the captains, you've got your ballistas, especially with Oath of Moment, that +1 to wound. It's a bonkers strong ability to have access to. And it can really make your opponent kind of feels bad, they just never had a chance to survive. -1 to hit becomes a lot less impactful. Any negatives to wound, or it suddenly takes you from wounding stuff on 3s to wounding on 2s. And yeah. And again, you've got a little bit of that kind of meta aspect here with the stat check. You've got all those ballistas, the Vindicator, the Redemptor, even the Terminators. It's a lot of 2-up saves. A lot of mistakes that your opponent can make. So thanks for watching, everyone. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Bit of a long video this actually, but really enjoyed making it. Really enjoyed thinking about Space Marines outside of the kind of epic heroes that you have. And yeah, this was based on a poll that was done at the beginning of the year, what kind of content people wanted to see. I hope they liked it, and I hope this is the kind of thing, and learned a little bit from this. And I'm not saying go out and build this exact list. There's plenty of better lists, I'm sure, to kind of net deck, but I think this is kind of an evergreen sort of list, and there's a lot of sort of fundamentals about how Space Marines work to learn from this. So I hope people did. And let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see a specific chapter. If you'd like to see my Hammer of Averni build that I talked about earlier. If you'd like to see perhaps a different Salamanders list, things like that. There's plenty of great theory crafting to do with Marines, as they have such a deep roster of stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching.